And Bernard, it's lovely to have you with us. And I gather that you spent most of your career as a surgeon.
Yes.
And so it'd be lovely to hear a bit of your experience. We've got quite a few junior doctors and medical students amongst us. So I wonder if you could look back and tell us some of the most memorable moments in your training to be a medic.
Oh, there's so many. And I suppose as far as my Christian life goes, when I was at school, I got utterly disillusioned with school religion. You had to go to chapel, and it was, for me, I just thought it was an utter bore. It didn't seem to relate to anything. And I thought, and we had a chaplain at the school who liked to dress up, I thought, a bit like the Mikado. And I thought, well, if God can't see through this pantomime, what is this? So I refused to get confirmed like everyone else did at school. But I was very fortunate that my parents were Christians, and I'd been to some camps when I was a boy. And I'm sure that put in a foundation. And then when I went off to college, I went to Downing, and there I met some Christians who got me thinking again. I took quite a long time, well, it seemed to me months, before I made a commitment to Christ, because I really didn't want to be conned. If God had given me a mind, it must fit in. And that's how I started. Then things went quite fast. In my last 2 years at college, things were dramatic. We saw 60 of my fellow students in the college, and we only had 350 a year coming up, that they became Christians, and many of them are going on. And then when I went down to the London hospital for my clinical training, they made me president of the CU for some reason. But it was quite remarkable. We had about 180 coming to the London hospital weekend away. And then I was very involved with Dick Lucas at St. Helens, and I eventually became his student worker. But I'm a born surgeon. I love making decisions and acting on them. So I went back into surgery and went to the Marsden as a senior registrar, went to King's. I nearly became a consultant at St. George's, but that's another story. And then I went out to North Herts as a surgeon with interest in cancer surgery.
Right. Wow. What an interesting and varied career. And more latterly, I gather that you've been involved in leading a church as well. What do you most enjoy about that? What's your favorite thing about belonging to your church family?
Well, in North Hertfordshire, where we lived, there weren't churches like Christchurch Balham. We just didn't have them. There was such a lot of compromise going on. And then one day I was asked, would I consider starting a church that's concentrating on getting people thinking and thinking about the Bible and how it relates to everything else. And that was just my cup of tea, because I was by then talking at Christian unions and going off and doing international conferences and things. And to have a church, again, very much like Christchurch Balham, where we would concentrate on getting people thinking about what the Bible teaches and how that relates to everyday life. And that's 20 years ago. And it's been quite exciting.
Mm. Oh, good.
So I've moved really over from being a surgeon into being a Bible teacher, and I hope trying to get people thinking.
Brilliant. And I guess that's probably connected to, I know you've written a couple of books, and so could you just tell us about them and why you wrote them?
Well, the second book I did was, I had a lot of patients being a cancer surgeon who you have to say, look, I'm sorry, the cancer's come back. And many of them would actually saying, what's life about? Why has this happened to me? And so I read this book, Cure for Life. I don't know if you've seen it. That's been translated into countries all over the world. Basically to say, what is the Christian message? What did Jesus, who did he say he was? What evidence is there to support that? And frankly, is it true? And then what did Jesus teach? So it's pretty basic stuff with quite a lot of stories. And that really started me off. And now I've just had one published on should all Christians be talking about these things? The duty of a disciple. And there's another one coming, is science and faith. How do they fit together? Because I passionately believe that, as we'll see this evening, that all aspects of knowledge come together in the Christian message. It's, in fact, without the Christian message, you can't make sense of science, of philosophy, of anything. But that's quite a big story.
Well, thanks for whetting our appetite. And it sounds like those books would be suitable for all kinds of people, whether you call yourself a Christian or not. Is that right?
Oh, yes. I have, I'm very keen. We have a weekly Bible study every Friday. And we invite non-Christians. So I'm probably about a quarter of the people are not Christians. They're just seeking. And that's wonderful. It makes the Bible study be a bit more relevant and practical, and you have to think it through. So many Bible studies, people think, oh, this is just for Christians. But if it is the Word of God, then just as a church sermon should be open to non-Christians, so should our Bible studies. We should, I think, that's possibly the first place that we should invite friends to come and see, because there's none of the the long prayers and the multiple hymns and the other things that some people find off-putting.
Well, thank you, Bernard. And as you've been listening in so far to our chat this evening, then let me add my welcome once again if you've arrived since we began. And as you would have just heard, this event is very much for anyone, whoever you are, whether you're part of our church family or if you're a guest, a friend maybe, or a family member of somebody who's invited you along. Very warm welcome, whoever you are. And I'm going to hand over now to Bernard, who's going to have the floor for the next little while. And then, as always, after that, we'll have time for a Q&A. So please do type questions into the chat as they come to your mind, or to save them up and ask them at the end. You can do that in the chat or unmute yourself and ask them in person, whatever you prefer. So once again, welcome. Feel free to hide your video if you prefer to do that, if you're not comfortable being there visible on Zoom. But you're really welcome. And Bernard, over to you.
Thank you. Well, the topic I've been given is faith rational, or why is Christianity rational? In a mother's womb, there were two babies. Do you believe in life after birth? One of them asked. Of course, everybody knows there's life after birth. We're here now because we have to grow and get ready for what's to come. That's ridiculous. There's no life after birth. What could such a life be like? Well, I don't know exactly, but there must be more light than in here. Maybe we'll walk on our legs and eat with our mouth. Nonsense. It's impossible for us to walk. Eating with our mouth? That's crazy. We get all our food through our umbilical cord. Don't you know that? And obviously there's no life after birth because, frankly, the umbilical cord is too short. Well, I think it is possible. It'll be different. But nobody's ever come back from life after birth, have they? Birth is just the end of life. And frankly, life is just meaningless existence in the darkness. There's no point to it. And we're going nowhere. No, I don't think exactly it's like that after birth. I'm sure that we'll see our mother and she'll take care of us. Mother? You believe in mother? And just where is she then? Well, she's all around us. We're inside her. We're her children. In her we live and move and have our being. Without her, we wouldn't exist. That's absurd. I've never seen mother, so there's no such thing. Well, for some people, seeking God in our lives can seem a bit like that. It can seem a little bit illogical, impossible. We all know that people around us who think there is no answer to life, we're just here, that the material world is all we've got. But seeking answers, being curious about life after death, why I'm here, what's the purpose of life, these are all great human qualities, and we are meant to pursue them. I don't know if you've heard the story of Yuri Gagarin. Sorry, before we get to him, let me just tell you about Khrushchev. He was giving a lecture to a meeting of the communists in Russia, the Central Committee of the Communist Party. And he was extolling the virtues of an atheistic, anti-religious campaign. And he gave us evidence that there was no God as Yuri Gagarin. He said, Gagarin flew into space, but didn't see any God out there. Now, clearly such an argument limits the search for God to visual sight. The obvious response would be to broaden the parameters and say, well, if Gagarin had opened the door of his satellite, he could have done. He'd have died. You can see the point. Just because we can't see God doesn't mean he's not there. And when we die, we all will meet God. Now, one of the, another new book I'm just trying to come up with now is called Stepping Stones. And we're going to be looking at the evidence that there is across this river. Imagine you're on one bank of the river, which is the sort of world we're in, with a veneer of niceness, but underneath it, it's pretty selfish and increasingly, what's the point? Is it just me? The other side of the river is this ideal world. It's a godly world where people are working together in harmony because they're all living under the authority of this beneficent God. And you can say, yeah, that sounds ideal, but it's unreal. We're here in this world. Okay, hatred and dishonesty and all these features are around us. And the other bank, it's too ideal. And although there are many benefits which we can see from living in God's kingdom, it's not our experience. Now, what I've come to realize is that there are many rational arguments. All these stepping stones are different arguments to the fact that there is a creator God who has entered this world, and it all makes sense of the way we're made. So all these stepping stones can be subdivided into three groups. You've got science, evidence from history, and evidence from our instincts. There are other things, but you can put them all into those sort of categories. Now, I'm going to start off with science, because obviously my background is science. Stephen Hawking can't explain why we're here. And then when you think about it, science only answers how we're here. Hawking says, although science may solve the problem of how the universe began, it cannot solve the problem Why does it bother to exist? There are bigger questions. Yeah, people often say quite blindly, well, science is all we've got. It excludes the need for God. Now, there are many, many problems with this one. I love the answer of Sir William Bragg. He was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. And this is what he said. It's rather beautiful. From religion comes man's purpose. From science, his power to achieve it. Some people ask if religion and science are opposed to one another. They are, in the same way that the thumb and the fingers are opposed to one another. It's an opposition by which anything can be grasped. It's no coincidence that the Renaissance of science began with Christian men realizing that we're in a logical, rational world, and therefore it can be analyzed and understood. They were people who believed God spoke to us through his word. Now, if you look at our world, it's made for man. I'm sure you've heard the word Anthropic Principle. It comes from the Greek anthropos, for man. How is it that we live in a world that's ideal for us to live in? Everything is just right. If our Earth lived 2% closer to the sun, we would be too hot. 2% further out, too cold. The ellipse that we're on around the sun has to be almost circular, which is quite unusual to stop the great variations in temperature. We need an atmosphere that's 21% oxygen. Have you thought what would happen if there's too much oxygen? You know, every time you lit a fire, it would explode. You've got to have that 79% or 78% nitrogen around us. We need oxygen and carbon atoms with exactly the right amount of specific energy, so you can get chains of carbon to get organic molecules. This is highly specific, very carefully thought through. These physical constants of the universe had to be there before the universe began. If there was a Big Bang, which there's good evidence for, these constants had to be precisely right before the world began. I don't know if you remember what's the mass of a proton compared to an electron. It's 1,836 times the mass of the electron. Now, that had to have been set before the Big Bang in Planck time. 1 in 10 to the minus 43rd of a second, right at the beginning of time. That constant had to be set. Now, how come, and that's only 4 of them I've mentioned, there's about 140 so far that are known. They're all exactly right for us to live in a world where we can happily live. The only answer that's come up to this problem is the idea of the multiverse. You know, perhaps there's an infinite number of universes, and it just happens that the only one that works is the one that we're on. A man called Michael Horton, he wrote in The New Scientist on this. When physicists whisk us into the realms of multiverses and universe-gobbling particles, it's time to ask whether there's something amiss. This is sheer fiction. There's no evidence for this. And anyway, a God would still need to create the multiverses out of nothing. It doesn't answer anything. I don't know if you've thought about the issue of rules in nature. You know, people talk about the laws of nature or the laws of science. But actually, laws can only describe how things work, how things behave. The question has got to be, whose mind is behind nature and science? Nature can't make up laws. It can't define how it's going to work. And Einstein recognized this as a major problem. That the basis of the scientific method was the fact that the universe is rational. And he very astutely said this: the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. It's this rationality that's led the many philosophers to realize that the universe must be the product of a highly intelligent mind. So Isaac Newton, the great scientist there in the 17th century, he gave us our understanding of gravity and a lot else. One day he was in his rooms in Cambridge, and a friend of his who was an atheist came in, and he noticed on his desk he'd got this model of the solar system. And his atheist friend said, "Oh, that's beautiful. Tell me, who made it?" "Nobody," said Newton. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. Somebody made it." Then Newton says, "Don't you realize, if no one has a problem in realizing that a model needs a maker, why is it such a problem when confronted with the real universe?" It's a very poignant reply. And Fred Hoyle, he was certainly far from being a Christian, an astrophysicist. And just looking at an overview of everything, he said, "I don't believe that any scientist who's examined the evidence would fail to draw the inference that the laws of nuclear physics have been deliberately designed with regard to the consequences they produce within the stars. The only way is that it's designed. A common sense interpretation," he goes on, "of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there's no blind forces worth speaking about in nature." There's another professor in astronomy in Harvard. "Fred Hoyle and I differ on lots of questions, but on this we agree. A common sense and satisfying interpretation of our world suggests the designing hand of a super intelligence." Now, if you want to go more into this, you'll have to wait till this new book comes out. Now, biology is another whole group of stepping stones. Now, I hear you've done quite a lot on that here, so I'm not going to spend much time on this. Now, what's the source of new genetic information? How does an ape, if it did develop into a human, how on earth did all that amazing, new, rational, all in the right place, genetic information develop just in 5 million years? Professor Anthony Flew, you might have heard of him. He was an atheist philosopher at Reading, professor of philosophy. And it was the business of DNA and the ability of a cell to hold so much information that led him to decide there has to be a God. He said this: "It is, for example, impossible for evolution," that's Darwinism, "to account for the fact that one single cell can carry more data than all the volumes of encyclopedia put together. It now seems to me that the findings of more than 50 years of DNA research have provided materials for a new and enormously powerful argument to design." What I won't go on. It's a subject that I enjoy very much. But what are the consequences of this idea of scientism? Have you heard of Professor Haeckel? He was a professor of zoology in Germany in the end of the Victorian times, very ardent follower of Darwinism. He popularized it a lot in Germany. He wrote this: "What good does it do to humanity to maintain artificially and rear the thousands of cripples, deaf mutes, idiots, etc., who are born every year with the hereditary burden of incurable disease?" He was very keen on eugenics. He encouraged involuntary euthanasia, the active killing of hundreds of thousands of incurables. And Hankel, he also recommended the indiscriminate destruction of incorrigible criminals. Well, you know how that developed. Hitler took it on. It became the basis for the extermination of gypsies, of people in insane problems, other undesirables, Jews, and even prisoners of war. When my wife and I visited the extermination camps in Auschwitz and Birkenau, the truth of what happens when men become gods and reject the authority of a creator becomes very apparent. Hitler had envisaged a generation that had rejected the old ideals. And actually he boasted, I don't know if you know these words, "I freed Germany from the stupid and degrading fallacies of conscience and morality. We will train young people for whom the world will tremble. I want young people capable of violence, imperious, relentless, and cruel." You see, when man turns away from God and we're basically on our own, the agenda is set by whoever is most powerful. It was Nietzsche who said this, that when without God, anything goes. Let's leave science there. Move on to the evidence from history, all these stepping stones. And particularly, I'm going to concentrate on the history of the Christian faith. I don't know if you've looked at the Old Testament prophecies. I had a friend who's a surgeon in my hospital who became a Christian. And this is one of the things that grabbed him, these prophecies about a Messiah who's going to enter this world, who'd be God, who would be born in Bethlehem, who'd die by crucifixion, who'd rise from the dead. 330 prophecies, and they're all there for anyone to look at today. The evidence for Jesus is immense for anyone who wants to look at it. And what he claimed to be the one and only God. And yet his character, he was strong, but very compassionate to those in need, and particularly to any who turned back to God for forgiveness, for going their own way. His miracles, his death, his resurrection. You can get your teeth into this. Anyone who's a skeptic, they need to, because this is the only person who's ever claimed to be God who would rise from the dead and not die again. The evidence, the history of the early church. You know, what made this church expand so fast that in spite of all the persecution and all these problems, people wanted to become Christians? What happened? Why were they so convinced about Jesus? The early apostles, they kept telling everyone, Jesus is someone remarkable. You know, 11 out of the 12 apostles were willing to die, and they did. They were either executed by the state or lynched by the mobs for telling people that this Christian story, that Jesus is God who raised from the dead, who did these miracles, is really true. and the evidence resonated with them, and something inside them made them realize it was true. The early church is a very powerful argument for the existence and the evidence for the resurrection. Now, that's another one. What did happen to Jesus? You can't get away from the fact that that tomb was empty. Nowhere found his body. And these people swore that they'd seen him after he'd risen from the dead. Everywhere that the apostles went, they taught and kept saying, Jesus and the resurrection. That's our message. Well, it's a convincing story. He reasoned, the early apostles kept reasoning with people. You must be Christians because it's true. And we've got to do the same today. These stepping stones arguments are very persuasive. When he went to Corinth, Paul vigorously refuted the Jews in public debate, proving from the scriptures, because the Jews would accept the scriptures, that Jesus was the Christ. Now, the last group of stones that gets me is the evidence for instincts. It's very powerful stuff. After I'd given a lecture at the University of Hertfordshire on the evidence from science, I got surrounded by a group from the Atheist Society who wanted to argue for the multiverse. And I didn't really want to go down that tack. So I did something I hadn't done much before and talked about these instincts that all people that I know have this instinct that they should be honest, they should be kind, that there is truth, these values matter, integrity. And they said, yeah, we've all got that. You say, well, where did that come from? If we've just come in a godless universe out of primordial soup, how do we get these values? Everyone's got them. You know the music group, The Who, they made a record called The Seeker, which included the line, I've got values, but I don't know how or why. Well, the answer is we've been made in God's image. Sartre, he rejected God, but during the Second World War and after the war for independence in Algeria, he reacted against the violence and the inhumanity, firstly of the Nazis, and he said this is wrong. But his philosophy of godlessness says, well, I can't really say that. He wrote nothing of importance after this. You see, the tension he had, that as a human being, he'd got values, but his philosophy said he hadn't. These are real big issues for us. Nietzsche said, people who get rid of the Christian God and now believe more firmly that they must cling to Christian morality. When one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality from under one's feet. You see, our traditions, our laws in this country of fairness and honesty are based on Christian values. When we see jihadi John beheading an innocent man, doesn't that shout at you, this is wrong? God does not intend people to behave like this. This is evil. And there's guilt. Guilt is a very real thing in our society. People can't explain it, but it's there. And people long that they should be forgiven. There's no answer to guilt except in the Christian message. I don't know if you heard of Margarita Lasky. She's a humanist. She was involved in a television debate with a Christian. And she said this, what I envy most about you Christians is your forgiveness. I've no one to forgive me. And the reality of guilt is a very real thing. We have it, all of us, in us. Is it just because of what we've been told by our parents? Or is there a deeper value? There's a God-shaped gap within us. We've been made by God. Augustine, the great Christian leader, says, you've made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in you. C.S. Lewis, when he became a Christian, he said exactly the same thing, that God answers all the big problems that we've got. Then there's the problem of sin. If we're honest, we all know we're not what we ought to be. We have been rebelled against God. And that's what Jesus came to talk a lot about. It's a very strong evidence that the Christian faith is true. I think the great issue is when you look at all this evidence, and there's so much more, that people come to the last step and say, yes, 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 I can see that. But this last step is difficult. And it's a different step. It's not rational. The last step is moral. Will I allow this man who calls himself God, who raised from the dead, to be my Lord? And our natural independence is, I don't want him. So people can then say, well, I think it's a leap of faith into becoming a Christian. I reject that now. I think the leap of faith is when you're on that step to say, I reject God, I reject Jesus, I'm going to leap back into this purposeless world that I'm in now, where values I know are artificial, where he who rules, who has authority, has control. That's the leap of faith. The step of faith is a very logical one based on all this evidence, but it's a moral one. Am I willing to allow the creator of the universe to be my Lord? I became a Christian, as I said, in my first year at university, and I didn't want to be conned. If only someone had told me all this evidence. Well, they did gradually. But for me, the evidence from science, the evidence from Jesus, the history, but particularly the evidence from these instincts within us, says, I need the forgiveness that only Jesus can give me. I think that's enough from me. Should we open it up to any queries that people have got?
Thank you, Bernard, so